So buckle your seatbelts, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at the Big Blocks exhibit at the Savoy Automobile Museum in Cartersville, Georgia. I'm Steve Starling, a volunteer docent here at the Savoy, and this exhibit was on display at the Savoy from August the 2nd through December 4th of 2023. The exhibit featured cars that some people call muscle cars, American muscle cars. It was one of the most popular exhibits we've had so far at the museum, and I'm anxious to get started. We're doing this for the archives of the museum, so officially for the archives, it's 12:05 on September 28th, 2023. So let's get started. So before we start talking about individual cars, I want to say a word about terminology, the terminology that we use today. This is the Big Blocks exhibit. All of the cars in this exhibit certainly have big blocks. For the record though, some folks might not consider them all to be muscle cars. A muscle car, a very narrow definition of muscle car, is a car that has two doors, has a big engine, is a medium-sized car, and is a car that's affordable to most people. Well, that definition would exclude some of these cars. For example, this beautiful Corvette here that we'll talk about shortly. A purist would say this Corvette is a sports car, not a muscle car. We're not going to worry about that today, though. We're going to consider all these cars to be muscle cars. They all came from the same point in time, and I want to talk a little bit about why that time occurred. Why did the muscle car era occur? Well, it was this confluence of events that caused it to happen. First, there were all these advancements in technology that took place following World War II. These advancements in technology not only allowed the manufacturers to develop more powerful engines, but also more reliable engines, engines that could be used as a daily driver 365 days a year. A second factor was that the mood of the country was good, the economy was good. People had money in their pocket, money to spend on automobiles, and they wanted performance automobiles. The third factor is that there was this whole wave of baby boomers coming of age during the 1960s. These baby boomers were increasing in numbers throughout the 60s. They were buying their first cars. Again, they wanted performance cars. And the final reason is that for most of this period of time, all three of the major manufacturers were competing against each other in racing at different levels. And that competition spawned more and more performance. The cars got more and more powerful during this time period, and that's why the muscle car era occurred. We'll talk a little bit later about why the muscle car era ended, but now we're going to start talking about the individual cars. So the first car we'll talk about today is this beautiful 1967 Chevrolet Corvette. It's owned by the museum, part of the museum's collection, and I'll tell you a little about the history of the Corvette. The Corvette was first introduced in 1953, and when it first started, it wasn't a big seller. They only had 6-cylinder engines in Corvettes back in those days. In 1955, all that changed when they started dropping in V8s in the Corvettes. Next year, 2023, will be the 70th anniversary of the Corvette. Now these days we refer to Corvettes by their C numbers. A different C number is given each time the model changes from an appearance standpoint. And today we would refer to this as a C2 Corvette. The C2 Corvettes were made from 1963 through 1967. Now we're up to the C8 model with the mid-engine model that was introduced back in 2020. But they actually had not intended for there to be a 1967 C2 Corvette. The plan was for the C3s to come online in 1967, but they just weren't ready. So mid-model year, they decided to do another year of C2s, and some people think that this is the best one that there ever was. A classic among classics. It's just beautiful. The stance of the car is such that it looks like it's about to go fast. It looks very aggressive. And the styling is just wonderful. The big thing you notice first is this big stinger on the hood. The whole car has a cleaner look than the 66 model. The crossed flags logo is smaller than in previous models. There are no side logos or medals on badges on this car. A couple of other things I'll point out. You'll see 427 here. This has a 427 cubic inch displacement engine, and it generated 435 horsepower. Now I'm going to put an asterisk right here and say that there's this popular conception that all the car manufacturers during the 1960s were understating the horsepower capability of these engines. So I'll leave that to you as to whether you believe the 435 horsepower. But just beautiful. This is one of only 720 67 Corvettes that have these bolt-on aluminum wheels. The hubcap there is actually a hubcap. It comes off so that you can get to the bolt and change the wheel. You'll also notice that this car has redline tires. This is the first year that redline tires were offered on the Corvette. As a matter of fact, redline tires were only offered in the entire history of the Corvette on the 1967 models, the 68 models, and the 69 models. The redline tire option, you could get 5 redline tires by paying an additional $46.60 back in the day. It's kind of interesting. You look at these pipe sleeves. I don't have any evidence to support this other than the one conversation that I had with the gentleman, but a gentleman came up to me after a tour of the Savoy one day and told me that he knew that some of these pipe sleeves, maybe not all of them, but some of them were made here in Cartersville because as a teenager he had worked on the press for the company that manufactured them. But again, this is just a beautiful car. So now we'll take a look at the interior of the car. Get to see the dashboard layout. You see the speedometer there with up to 160 on the speedometer, tachometer there, all the gauges. You see in the center console, the upper part of the console there, you've got a clock, below it a vertically mounted radio. And I'll mention that for the first time in the C2 model, the handbrake or the parking brake is actually located on the center console. Previously it was a lever under the dash. So coming around to the back of the car, just adding to the overall clean look of this car is this color-coded fuel filler door. The color-coded fuel filler doors were only offered on the C2 Corvette in 1967. Earlier models had chrome fuel filler covers. One thing I'll mention before we move on to the next car is that you see the Corvette Stingray logo on the back. This was the last time that Stingray was used on a Corvette as 2 words. It disappeared entirely for 1968, came back in 69, and has been since then a single word, Stingray. So now let's go take a look at some Ford Motor Company products. So I mentioned earlier that during the 1960s, there was this big bow wave of baby boomers that were coming of age and would be buying automobiles. A lot of people recognize this. One was Lee Iacocca, who at that time was general manager at Ford. Iacocca believed that these baby boomers would be interested in buying sporty cars that were affordable cars, and he set his team about developing what became the Ford Mustang. Tremendous success from day one. It was introduced in April of 1964, and from April through August, it sold 120,000 copies. For all of the 1965 model year, it sold over 500,000 copies. Now this is an interesting bit of automobile trivia. Those cars who were bought or were built and bought mid-model year 64, the cars that people lovingly refer to today as 64.5 Mustangs or 64.5 Mustangs, were actually all titled as 1965 Mustangs, not 1964. Some automobile trivia for you. Iacocca recognized also that while the Mustang was a sporty car, it wasn't a performance car, not close, but that given the demand for performance vehicles in the muscle car era that was coming along, there needed to be a performance version of the Mustang. So it's very natural that he would turn to his friend Carroll Shelby to build that performance version of the Mustangs. They had worked together earlier on the Shelby Cobras, and also were working together on the GT40s that were the subject of the famous film Ford versus Ferrari. Shelby began developing the performance version of the Mustang. It was introduced in 1965 as the GT350. Now, they couldn't put really big V8 engines in the 65 and 66 GT350s. There wasn't room in the engine compartment. But for 67, the standard Mustangs expanded the engine compartment to the point that you could put a big block engine in there, and that was the birth in 1967 of the GT500s. This automobile that we're looking at here is a 1968 GT500. It's got a 428 cubic inch Police Interceptor engine in there. And it's a beautiful car. It's a car that'll move too. I'll mention a few things about the car, maybe some things that differentiated it from earlier GT500 models and GT350s. For 1968, the hood scoops are forward. For the 67 model, they were back further on the hood. Also for 1968, the badging was different. The badging here, Carroll Shelby called this a Tiffany badge. The previous badges on the GT500s had been flat badges. This is textured. Interestingly, they only made one of them. And so the same badge is on the driver's side that's on the passenger side. And because the snake can only point one way on the same badge, on the driver's side, the snake is looking backwards, whereas on the passenger side, the snake is looking forward. The interior of this car is wonderful. It has wood grain appliques, very clean. By this time in the history of the GT350 and GT500, the people were looking for comfort, not only performance in this car, but they were looking for comfort features in the car. This has got them. It's got great final seats here. The Shelby Cobra logo is on the console there and also on the shifter. You'll notice it has upper and lower hood scoops. I'm sorry, side scoops. The upper scoops are a nod to the upper scoops that were on the GT40s that won at Le Mans in 1966. They had the upper hood scoops, and they are to an extent functional. For the 1968 model year, the lower, I call them these hood scoops, actually they're side scoops. For the 1968 model, however, the lower side scoop is not functional. The previous models, it created cooling air for the brake system, but this is not a functional side scoop for this year model, but it sure does look cool on the car. People who own these cars used to joke about how all this was really good for, in addition to looking good, was that when you drove down the road in the fall, it collected leaves, but you literally had to clean it out. If you come around to the back of this car, you'll notice that there's big Shelby lettering there that didn't appear on previous models. And the turn signals on this car are modified turn signals from a 1965 Ford Thunderbird. They're sequential turn signals. Beautiful, beautiful car, beautiful example of a performance car. Carroll Shelby had such a big hand in developing this car, and very much a part of automotive history. This is a part of the museum collection. The color, you can guess it, candy apple red. Now we're going to take a look at another Mustang and talk about a different issue, the issue of homologation. So I mentioned the word homologation. Back in the old days, we would have said that was a 50-cent word. These days, that's about a $5 word. But to homologate something means to ratify it or to approve it. In the context of racing, it means approval by a sanctioning body for the use of an engine or an automobile body in that particular circuit's races. In the context of NASCAR racing, in order to homologate a car so that the engine could be used or the body style could be used, under Bill France, the head of NASCAR's rules, you had to sell to the public at least 500 copies. Then Mr. France would consider it a stock car eligible for NASCAR racing. The car we're about to talk about, this 1970 Ford Mustang Boss 429, is what's called a homologation special. It was only built for the purpose of homologating or approving for use in NASCAR the 429 Ford engine that's inside this monster. They did approve it with the 69 model, and in 1969, 879 Boss 429s were sold to the public. In 1970, the year of this model, there were exactly 500 sold to the public. The word is that Ford lost money on every one it made, but making money on this car wasn't the purpose. It was getting this engine involved in NASCAR racing. It was very successful in 1969. The Boss 429 engine, I think Richard Petty that year in his Boss Torino Talladega won 10 races. I think David Pearson won the driver's championship with one of these engines that year. So it was successful. Beautiful car. Because there were only, doing the math, 1,379 of these cars made, this is a very collectible car these days because of its scarcity. It's a very rare car. This car is on loan to this exhibit from the Wellborn Musclecar Museum, which is in Alexander City, Alabama. Several cars are from the Wellborn Museum in this exhibit, and we really appreciate them loaning the cars to us for the purpose of big blocks. I'll talk a little about this car. The color of this car is grabber blue. This hood scoop on top of the big engine here is the largest hood scoop ever to appear on a Mustang. It's just a gorgeous car. This car has only 7,800 miles on it. It's not been restored at all. 7,800 miles. You look inside, looks very classy and everything, but you'll notice there aren't a lot of amenities in the car. It has an AM radio. I think AM radio might have been standard. You couldn't buy an FM radio. That wasn't the purpose of this car. It was to get that engine qualified for NASCAR racing. You couldn't buy air conditioning on this car. Just a beautiful car all around, and back in the old days when something was really good, we'd say that it was bad. This car is really bad. Now, I told you this is one of 1,379 that were made. The next car we're going to talk about is one of one. So I mentioned that the next car that we'd talk about was one of one, and it is. It's this incredible 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II. I need to tell you a little about the history of the time period in order to explain this car and how it came to be here today. In 1969, as we talked about earlier, Ford had homologated its Boss 429 engine for use in NASCAR. They did very well that season. The Boss 429 is in this car. However, some things were on the horizon that Ford needed to deal with. Chrysler had debuted the Superbird, and a car with a big wing, very aerodynamic, and they could see that in order to compete in 1970 with those aero cars, as we call them today, they needed a whole new body style. That also had to be homologated in order to qualify for use in NASCAR. Larry Shinoda, who was also involved in the Boss 429 development, was in charge of the Special Projects Unit at Ford, and his team developed 2 prototypes of this car. And then a couple of things happened that really affected the history of this car at that point. One was that Bunky Knudsen and Larry Shinoda left Ford. Another was that Ford was getting all sorts of heat from the federal government. We're talking about congressional hearings and everything, about the fact that it was spending more research and development funds on racing than it was spending R&D money on passenger safety or fuel economy. At that point, Ford almost completely shut down its racing program. There was no longer a need to develop these prototypes into production models, so the vehicle never got produced. The other prototype was destroyed. This is the only existing prototype. There's an interesting story about that. And of course, the story always starts with, this car is a barn find. This car was literally found in a barn on an Amish farm in Indiana. How did it get to be there? Well, it seems that It had been driven by a Ford executive for a while after they decided not to produce the car. That Ford executive, one story is he gave it to a friend of his who put it in a barn. Another story is that that executive put it in a barn. One way or another, it wound up in a barn in Indiana. The farm was sold to an Amish family. A gentleman named Steve Honnell, this car is on loan to the museum from Steve Honnell of Lewisburg, Tennessee. Mr. Honnell had worked as a Ford rep. He also was a drag star racer that's in the Drag Racing Hall of Fame. He decided he was going to track down this car, and he did all sorts of copious research and found out that it was in this barn in Indiana and purchased it from the family that owned the farm. He spent 5 years restoring this car, and it debuted in 2003 at the 100-year celebration of the beginning of Ford Motor Company. Just a fantastic car. I like these recessed headlights here. I mean, this car is so aerodynamic, it's just beautiful to think about. You got the hood pins here. As you walk back here, if you notice in the back seat of this car, there are jumpsuits that say Lincoln Mercury Division Technical Advisor. I assume those came either in the car or maybe they belong to Mr. Honnell from his work with Ford. I don't really know. And this very aerodynamic wing on the back of it. Just a beautiful car, one of its kind, and we're so fortunate to have it as part of this exhibit. So the next car we're going to take a look at today is this beautiful Chevrolet Nova SS396 tribute car. It's owned by the museum, and first I'll talk about what a tribute car is. A tribute car is a car that began life as something else, but has been modified to appear to be the car that it's making a tribute to, kind of like a tribute band. This car started life as a Nova. Now it's a tribute car, Nova 396. It's beautiful, gorgeous. Got an L78, 396 cubic inch engine in it. Got these beautiful hood scoops up front. They're faux air intakes, actually. And then also on the side, you have these vents, which are faux, but they're beautiful, very elegant in appearance. You've got these hammer-on wheels, which takes you back to the early days of automobiles. Although hammer-on wheels were being used on race cars as late as the 1960s. You look inside and it's 1970s cool. You got the white shifter knob that matches the white seats, all these real gauges in here. Just a beautiful car, a beautiful car. And we're just so happy to have it part of the museum collection, and very representative of the muscle car era, and particularly the height of the muscle car era, 1970. Now we're going to look at some more cars. So the late 60s, 1970 was kind of a different time for automobile manufacturers. There was a lot going on back in those days. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but the number of muscle cars that were being sold actually decreased in the late 60s, and we'll talk about why in a moment. But General Motors, for its part, I mentioned Ford's issues with congressional hearings and so forth. General Motors had been under a lot of scrutiny by the U.S. government for years. You had the Ralph Nader days when he was trying to put more of a focus on passenger safety, and General Motors was very much involved in that. Also, because it had such a large market share, General Motors was very concerned about about having the Justice Department break up its business, break up its individual divisions into separate companies under the antitrust laws. And it didn't want to hack off the government. It didn't want to do anything that it could be accused of in terms of doing something improperly from a passenger safety standpoint. So it arbitrarily decided in the late 60s not to put large 400+ cubic inch engines in its mid-size car. Well, sales were declining. For whatever reason, in 1970, General Motors said, all bets are off. The divisions can put as big an engine as they want to in these cars, and this is a 1970 example of that. It's a 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS LS6. The engine inside is a 454 cubic inch engine. It's a huge engine. This car is a beast, literally. It's a beautiful car too. This is a survivor car. It's never been restored, got the original paint job on it. The folks who collect cars say that these are the most valuable cars. A lot valuable than if this, more valuable than if this car had been restored at all. It's got a little ding here and there, but that's what you expect in a survivor car. This car is on loan to the museum, another car from the Wellborn Musclecar Museum in Alexander City, Alabama. It's got raised white letter tires, beautiful SS 454 badging. If you look inside here, it's got automatic transmission. You can see the handle shifter that's there. Ironically, you could get air conditioning in an LS5 Chevelle SS, but you couldn't get it in an LS6. I've heard some technical reasons why that was so. I don't know if they're true or not. It might just have been a situation where Chevrolet felt that if someone was buying an engine that would perform like this one does, they were more interested in power than they were air conditioning. But that's a fact. Just a beautiful car all around, the vinyl top. This car just looks so refined. It's a powerful car though. You see the Chevelle by Chevrolet SS badging on the rear. The name of the car, Chevelle, they say, is a combination of the word Chevrolet and Gazelle, which is consistent also with the Chevrolet Impala model. Two very fast animals and two great names for automobiles. So now we're going to move from the Chevrolet division to the Pontiac division and talk about a car that was created under the direction of the guy who made the first muscle car. So looking at this car, it is so 1970s. It's a 1970 model, but just look at these colors. It's a great car, and it's on loan to the museum. It's a 1970 Pontiac GTO Judge Ram Air 4. And it's on loan to the museum from the Wellborn Musclecar Museum in Alexander City, Alabama. This car has gotten a lot of attention during this exhibit. It's just a beautiful car. Before we talk specifically about the car, let's talk about the GTO. John DeLorean, who is famous, he went on to found DeLorean Motor Company. John DeLorean, at the time that this car was designed and in previous years, was the chief engineer at Pontiac. And in 1964, he had a team create what is generally believed these days to be the first modern muscle car, the 1964 Pontiac GTO. Officially in the General Motors lexicon, GTO stood for Grand Tempest Option. The GTO was part of the Tempest line, but it kind of hacked off the folks at Ferrari because they were selling one of the most collectible cars in the world today, the Ferrari 250 GTO. And GTO for Ferrari stood for Gran Turismo Omologato, which in Italian or in English means Grand Touring Homologated. We talked about that word earlier, that $5 word. I think John DeLorean in 1964 was planning to go racing. At any rate, by the late 60s, the GTO line had gotten kind of stale, and so DeLorean, who is now the head of the Pontiac division, asked his team to develop a new GTO that would begin sales in 1969. Their marching orders were to design a less expensive one because they weren't competing well with the Plymouth Duster, which was billed at that time as being a more economical muscle car. So his team came to him with a proposal. He rejected it. They had a 350 engine in the GTO, and he said, guys, get real. You can't compete with a 350 engine in a 400 cubic inch world. So they went back, did another design of the car, and came up with an engine that had 400 cubic inches, and that's what's in here with this Ram Air 4. It's just a beautiful car. One more historic note. Americans landed on the moon in July of 1969, and at General Motors, like a lot of other companies, everything during that time period, products were named after things relating to the space program. The color of this car might look more like school bus yellow, but the color is orbit orange in a nod to the space program. At any rate, it's just a beautiful car. It's got these decals on the sides and on the top. You got Ram Air 4 on the air induction port here. It is a functional air induction port. The air feeds down into an area on top of the hood. It doesn't do much from a horsepower standpoint, but it sure does look cool. And moving back, we talked about the exterior color. The vinyl top is sandalwood officially, and the interior, the color is parchment. And you've got a couple of interesting things inside the car. You've got this factory installed 8-track tape player. Kind of brings back the memories of the days. You'd play an 8-track tape too long and you'd suddenly realize that you were hearing two different songs playing at the same time, which is kind of cool. You don't get that much these days. It's got a manual transmission, but it's got a T-handle shifter, which is kind of unusual. You don't see that very often. But just a beautiful automobile. He called it the Judge because at that time a very popular TV program was Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, one of the most popular shows on television. And they had this skit that involved a guy dressed up like a judge with a balloon hammer. At the end of the skit, he'd end up bopping someone on the head with this balloon hammer. But the way they would introduce the skit was with comedian Flip Wilson saying over and over again, "Here comes the judge, here comes the judge, here comes the judge." It got to be kind of a part of popular lexicon back in those days. DeLorean said every time he turned on the television, he saw that skit, and so he decided to name the car the Judge. Other interesting things about this car, you've got this wing on the rear that looks really cool. You've got this psychedelic sort of badging on the car. I don't think it has any badging that are not decals, but just a beautiful automobile. We're happy to have it part of this exhibit, and we're going to take a look now at some other General Motors products. So we talked about why the muscle car era started. Let's take a minute and talk about why it ended. The muscle car era only lasted for about 10 years. It would have started in 1964 with the creation of the first muscle car, first modern muscle car anyway. The muscle car era ended by 1974, maybe even earlier than that, so about 10 years or maybe less. Again, it was a combination of factors that ended the muscle car era, just like there was a combination of factors that started it. The first factor was that the demographic changed. The market for these cars were young males. In 1967, 1968, and 1969, 500,000 of those young males each year were on the other side of the world fighting for their country in Vietnam. Those who were not in Vietnam had begun raising families by that time, and instead of muscle cars, performance cars, they were buying family cars. So the demographic changed for one thing. Secondly, the national mood in the economy changed. The economy at that time was not very good. There were several recessions during that time period too, I think, anyway. And inflation was a big problem. Gas prices were increasing. And the national mood had kind of soured. There were all sorts of political assassinations, civil unrest, and so forth. People weren't willing to shell out money on cars like they had been several years earlier. Two big reasons, though. The first was insurance rates. The insurance companies by that time had figured out that a lot of these cars had understated their horsepower capability, and insurance rates skyrocketed. If you could afford one of these nice muscle cars, it was a totally different matter whether you could afford to buy the insurance for it. The final and maybe biggest factor was that these engines could no longer meet the new emission standards from the federal government. In 1970, President Richard Nixon signed into law the Clean Air Act, which mandated that automobile emissions be reduced by half by 1975. He also by executive order, created the Environmental Protection Agency and authorized the EPA to begin issuing transitional regulations prior to 1975, which they started doing almost immediately. The engines in these muscle cars simply couldn't meet the new emission standards. Automobile manufacturers were faced with a choice of either discontinuing some of these performance car models, which happened, or dumbing them down from a performance standpoint in order to meet the new emissions requirements. So that's how the muscle car era ended. And now that we've got that Debbie Downer moment behind us, let's go look at some more cars. So the next car we're going to take a look at is this beautiful 1970 Oldsmobile 442 W30. The 442 debuted in 1964, and that's the way you say it, 442, not 442. It debuted in 1964 as a performance and trim option on the Oldsmobile Cutlass. The 442 stands for, or in those days stood for, 4-speed manual transmission, 4-barrel carburetor, and a dual exhaust. Later, by 1970, as we talked about earlier, General Motors allowed big engines to be put in these cars. The first 4 stood for 400 plus cubic inches of displacement, 4-barrel carburetor, dual exhaust. There's a 455 engine in this car. This is, in my mind, as I said earlier, just raw muscle. It's a great car and one of my favorites in the exhibit. Just kind of working from the front back here, you've got this bifurcated grille in front with 442 in the middle there. It's got a fiberglass hood on it so that it had less weight. Because it has a fiberglass hood, it's got these hood locks on either side. You don't want your very lightweight hood flying off as you're going down the road. But just so refined and beautiful. The badging on the side here, 442 W30. And then you go to the interior, and it just looks so elegant. You've got these accent buttons on the upholstery, which give it a really classy look, a 4-spoke steering wheel. If you can believe it, this is a survivor car. We talked about earlier how valuable those were. It's only got 7,500 miles on it. An outstanding, very, very, very collectible car. It's on loan to the museum, I should say, from the Stevens Performance Collection in Anderson, Alabama. So thanks to those guys for loaning the car for the purpose of this exhibit. So once again, I love this car. It is so representative of the muscle car era, and it just strikes me again as raw muscle, presented in a very refined, classy manner. Now we're going to take a look at a muscle car from one of its sister divisions. So the big 3 automakers each tiered their brands based on what they thought their customers' needs and wants were and what the customers could afford. At General Motors, Cadillac was, of course, at the top in terms of the brands. Cadillacs were expensive, luxurious cars, expensive relative to other cars. But just below it was Buick. Buick made very nice cars that were expensive, relevant to other brands, generally. At any rate, in 1964, Buick decided to get into the muscle car game. They were selling lots of, other manufacturers were selling lots of muscle cars. And so what they did was they developed a performance and trim option for the Buick Skylark, and they call it the Grand Sport, G-R-A-N Sport. Well, later that got shortened to GS, and for 1970, when all the GM brands had permission to put the really big engines in their cars, they called it the GSX, a 455 cubic inch engine. For a few more bucks, you could buy the Stage 1 option for that and get an even more powerful 455 cubic inch engine. And that's what this is, a GSX Stage 1 for 1970. Now, several interesting things about this. The first thing is the color, striking color. They only made 678 GSXs. 471 of them were in this color, which is Saturn yellow. Again, a reference to the space program. The Saturn V rocket was the rocket that propelled men to the moon. The only other color that they offered in this model was called Apollo White, a reference to the Apollo program. So 471 Saturn yellow cars. Of the 678, 400 of them were stage 1s, which is very interesting. I'll just talk about some of the features of this car kind of from front to back. You've got this sort of split grille up front here, and there's a lot of room between the outside of that grille and the radiator. So they figured out that the air rushing up through that void was creating lift on the front of the car. And so to deal with that issue, they put this big air dam down below. And very interesting, and it accomplished what they wanted to accomplish. These hood scoops on the hood are in fact functional, but if you notice closely, not all of the little openings are open. Some of them have plastic in there. Again, by design, but just an interesting thing about this car. You've got the hood tachometer on this car, and I read an interview with one of the guys who was involved in the design of this car, and he talked about how the black stripes on the hood are actually slightly different color than the side black stripes. And he told a story about leaving work one day before they had this realization, and how sunshine reflecting off the hood was blinding him as he was driving. And so instead they took the gloss off of this black stripe, and it's a matte finish. The side stripes, which we'll take a look at in just a moment, have a little bit of gloss in them. But around the perimeter of the big hood stripes is this very refined little red pinstripe. And it's just incredible the way the decals on this car make it just spectacular. Same for these side stripes. Got the pinstripe around the black stripe. You go inside on this car, and very Buick-like in nature, you've got these round gauges inside these rectangular pods, and it looks very classy. And you got several Buick logos in there. The car was only offered in 2 exterior colors. The interior could only be black, although I think I read that there were 2 different finishes that you could get on the black seats and black interior. Going down toward the back of the car, you've got, notice that there's no decal, GSX decal on the front fender. You've just got a small one at the back, which gives this car such a clean and refined look. But one of my favorite things about this car relates to how the side stripe goes up on the wing at the rear. It's just seamless the way it fits, and I personally can't imagine this car without the wing. In the middle of the wing, you've got the GSX logo back here, and then you've got this huge rear bumper, huge chrome rear bumper. Just such a classy automobile, and we're so happy to have it as part of the exhibit. It's on loan to the museum from the Wellborn Musclecar Museum, like some of the others, and we're so appreciative of them loaning it to us for the purpose of this exhibit. So we've talked about a lot of General Motors cars. Keep your seatbelts buckled, because now we're going to go to Mopar country. So I use the term Mopar. These days, people refer to just any Chrysler product as a Mopar, or anything to do with the Chrysler product as Mopar. Well, that's kind of an interesting story in and of itself, and it dates back to the early days of the Chrysler Company. They had a division called the Chrysler Motor Parts Company, and that got shortened to Mopar. They actually used that as a logo, as a brand name for Chrysler antifreeze that they sold during the 1930s, and that just grew to the point where anything Chrysler today is referred to as a Mopar. We're happy to have, as part of the exhibit, this beautiful 1968 red, gorgeous Dodge Charger RT. RT stands for Road and Track. It's on loan to the museum from the Stevens Performance Collection in Anderson, Alabama, and we're so happy to have it here. This car has a 426 Hemi engine in it, And a word about that. Hemi refers to the fact that the top of the combustion chamber is hemispherical in shape. Now, a lot of the other cars that we've looked at today also have the combustion chambers with hemispherical shapes at the top, but Chrysler was the company that trademarked the term Hemi. So when you see the term Hemi used, it's on a Chrysler product. Just a beautiful, they call this the elephant engine. Huge engine, generated lots of power. The 425 stated power might have been, it might have been more than that, as we talked about on some of these other cars. But has these red line tires that just gorgeous. You look inside the interior, it's all very classy and refined. You've got a 3-spoke steering wheel in there. You've got a tachometer with a clock inside of it. Back in the day, they call that a tick-tock-tack, which is kind of interesting. But one of my favorite things about this car is this buttressed back windshield. It's just gorgeous, looks very stylish and classy. And this was a fast car. It's a really fast car, and I really like it. It's got a racing style fuel filler door on it. And then you'll notice that it has these bumblebee stripes on the back of it. That's what they call them, bumblebee stripes. Several Dodge models that in that time period had those stripes, and their logo was Run with the Dodge Scat Packs, the ones with the bumblebee stripe. So now we're going to take a look at a Mopar product from 1971. So the final car we'll take a look at today is this 1971 Plymouth Hemi Cuda. When they had the Hemi engines in it, the elephant engine like this one, they didn't call them Barracudas, they called them Hemi Cudas. And there's so much to talk about with regard to this car. I'm just going to start up front and talk about the cheese grater grill, they called it, up front. And then you've got the shaker hood here. When you pull the hood pins, open the hood, there's a hole in the middle of the hood because the air scoop is actually connected to the air cleaner inside, and it's called a shaker hood because if we were to start this engine right now at idle, it would literally, the shaker bubble would literally shake on top of the engine. You've got these Barracuda gills down the side, just gorgeous. You look inside here and you know that this was intended for an upscale performance car buyer because it's got a factory installed tape recorder in there with a microphone so that you could dictate letters as you drove down the road. That also might be why it's got an automatic transmission, because you couldn't dictate and shift at the same time. But the big billboard stripe here at the rear of the car, this is one of, if not the largest stripes that ever has been put on a car. It's just incredible to look at. Then you've got the rear window louver package back here, and then this big wing on the back. Just a great car all around. I talked earlier about how some models were discontinued because of the emission standards that were coming down the pike in the early 70s, and this is a great example of that. This was the last model year. The 71 was the last model year for this car because by 72, some of these emission standards were coming down, and Plymouth decided, instead of dumbing down the car from a performance standpoint, just to end the model with the 71 model year. This is on loan to the museum from the Wellborn Musclecar Museum, and we are so happy to have it. It's gotten a lot of attention during the exhibit. It's a beautiful car. So today we've taken a look at the cars that were in the Big Blocks exhibit at the Savoy Automobile Museum in 2022. Great cars all. This is one of the more popular exhibits, if not the most popular exhibit that we've had since the museum opened almost a year ago. Several things to mention. Also a part of the exhibit was a lecture that was held on October 22nd, 2023. It featured some of the guys who loan cars to the museum for the purpose of this exhibit. Tim Wellborn of the Wellborn Musclecar Museum was here, and Ted Stevens of the Stevens Performance Collection was here. Thanks to those guys, and also to Steve Honnell, who loaned a car for this exhibit. Also want to say thank you to Ken Gross, the guest curator of the museum, who was very much responsible for arranging for this exhibit and planning this exhibit. As I said, this was one of the more popular exhibits that we've had at the museum. I specifically remember a situation where after a tour I gave here, a gentleman came up to me and it was like he had a tear in his eye almost. He said, "This looks just like my high school parking lot." He was really touched by the exhibit. It was great and we've enjoyed it. So I'm Steve Starling. Thanks for watching today and we'll see you next time.